Before we dive into the sessions, I do want to start with a bit of housekeeping. We have simultaneous interpretation for this webinar. So if you require translation from English to French, there are instructions on this slide and also in the chat box to help you access the French language channel. And I want to give a huge thank you to our translators who are on the call and who are essential to making sure everyone has access to the information. So thank you. We will also be recording this webinar so it can be used as a resource in the future. If you want to switch to the next slide. So I also want to take a moment to walk through the agenda and share how we will be spending these next 2 hours together. I'll soon be handing over to Martin Smith to provide some opening remarks from FP 2030. We'll then dive into session 1 to provide a brief overview of CIPs, specifically what exactly is a CIP, why they are useful, and how they are developed. I'll then hand over to Laura Hurley from Health Policy Plus and Michelle Folsom from Momentum, Country, and Global Leadership to share what we've learned now coming on 10 years of CIPs.
I speak.
If you could please mute your mic, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So this presentation from Laura and Michelle is really interesting. It'll elevate a number of common sticking points that I'm sure many on the call are quite familiar with in the CIP process. We'll have a brief break at 8:55 a.m. EST, and we'll return after 5 minutes for session 3, which will be 3 breakout rooms to explore and hear from country-level stakeholders in government and civil society on how they've tackled common challenges with CIPs, and have small group discussion to share lessons learned from all of our experiences. Finally, I'll take some time to reintroduce the CIP Resource Kit, including sharing what has been revised and what is new, and how these resources can be used to support CIP planning, development, and execution. We'll then end with a plenary discussion and Q&A. So I know this is a full agenda, and I'm thankful that you are setting aside 2 hours of your time to join us. And we really hope that this will be a forum to share the wealth of expertise, experience, and lessons learned that I know is present on this webinar. So I'm now going to hand over to Martin Smith, who is the Managing Director for FP 2030, for some opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you all around the globe. And as we look forward to 2030 and how we need to accelerate progress on commitments to increase access to rights-based family planning for women and girls everywhere, we wanted to take this important time together to reflect on this key tool to operationalize government commitments to family planning, the Family Planning Costed Implementation Plan. We're going to focus on the 10 years of experience of developing and executing CIPs that we now have, including breaking into those small groups that Rachel just took us through to discuss these common points and issues that we encounter within the CIP progress, and really hearing and delving into that country experience will be critical, of course. We'll take that closer look at the CIP Resource Kit. That's a series of 19 tools and resources, of course, to be used by program planners, ministry representatives, technical assistance providers, implementing partners, and a wide range of other stakeholders in a consultative way throughout the CIP development and execution process. The CIP Resource Kit itself evolved over the last 10 years as a result of collaboration, knowledge sharing, and thought leadership from numerous governments, partner organizations, technical experts, based on real hands-on experience over that decade. This year, over the last 12 months, a group of implementing partners and technical experts who make up the CIP Technical Working Group that meets regularly have participated in a refresh of the CIP Resource Kit, including revising certain resources and developing 4 new resources to fill identified gaps. And this refresh is part of a continuous learning and revision process. And your inputs and discussion today will further inform any future revisions to make the resource kit as practical, as user-friendly, and as needs and evidence-based as is possible. So before we really get into the meat of our agenda, I did want to thank a few key partners who've been absolutely essential in refreshing the CIP Resource Kit and organizing this webinar in a joint way. Members of the CIP Technical Working Group have played a leadership role in the work of the refresh, including Margaret Reeves, Michelle Weinberger, and Priya Emmett from Avenir Health, Anne Fitzer from JPIGO, the Momentum Global and Country Leadership project, of course, to Trinity Zan, sincere thanks, Trinity from FHI Knowledge Success, Laura Hurley from Palladium HP Plus, Christine Lassaway, and Karen Hardy from the What Works Association, along with a number of others. To UNFPA, specifically to Ben Light and Gamatiya Shogo, and to USAID, particularly Alex Todd, Pallavi Sharma, and Veena Menon. Sincere thanks indeed for the essential role that you've all played in funding this work and in validating the revised resources ahead of this launch. All of the country partners and stakeholders who provided feedback on CIPs and the resource kit over the past year, and indeed in the practice over the last decade, many thanks to you all as well. Thanks also to Rachel and to my colleague at FP 2030, Guillaume Debar, and the range of other FP 2030 colleagues for their hard work, both in the toolkit refresh and in putting together this webinar today, which we hope is timely and is helpful for country partners and colleagues. We look forward to the continued collaboration for accelerating progress in rights-based family planning and addressing the unmet need of women and girls through successful development and execution of the family planning CIP. Really excited about the next couple of hours together. And with that, back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Martin. So now we're going to dive straight into session 1, which is a brief introduction to costed implementation plans, or CIPs. Recognizing that this information may be very familiar with some of you all who are in the midst of developing CIPs or have recently developed a CIP, and for others, this may be new information. So at the end of this brief session, we will all have a shared understanding of CIPs. So to begin with, what is a costed implementation plan, or a CIP? A CIP is a multi-year roadmap designed to support a government in achieving its family planning goals. So CIPs can be particularly useful in transforming ambitious family planning commitments. So for instance, Family Planning 2030 commitments made under the Ouagadougou Partnership, or many others, to transform them into concrete programs and policies. And we have seen in practice the critical role that CIPs can play in FP programming over the past 10 years or so, and across many countries. And to give you an idea of scale, since 2012, and as of January 2022, 42 countries have completed at least one CIP, and 8 of those 42 countries have completed more than one. And I believe there are some countries that are even in the process of developing a 3rd CIP. So we're really in this 2nd and 3rd generation of CIPs, which is really exciting to reflect on what we've learned and think about what can be the future of CIPs. And I think something that can be helpful to note at this stage is that CIPs are not meant to exist in a vacuum, but are rather meant to align with and complement other existing family planning and health policies, strategies, and procedures. We've certainly learned over the past decade that ensuring that CIPs are additive and not duplicative of existing policies and processes is essential to ensure that they are used and implemented. And this is important to avoid duplication of effort, to ensure complementarity of action, and to strengthen national partners' advocacy messaging for policy, budget, and implementation commitments to family planning. And so for one example that I think is relevant for many on the call is thinking about alignment of CIPs with Family Planning 2030 commitments, which I know many countries have either recently completed or are in the process of developing. So CIPs can be used as useful tools to support both the operationalization and execution of existing FP 2030 commitments, or even to lay the groundwork for future FP 2030 commitments. So this gets into the next question, and you can switch the slide. Why develop a CIP? CIPs can play different roles based on contexts and needs. And CIPs often sit at the nexus of several key functions, and depending on the context, they may lean towards one or more of these functions than the others. So for example, a CIP can play a key role in operational planning, something we've already started discussing. So bringing detail and strategy to high-level family planning goals and commitments. A CIP can also help to identify and prioritize a few key strategic areas to invest in, and that will catalyze progress towards a country's family planning goals. CIPs can also play a key role in advocacy and resource mobilization. So a CIP could be used to build the case for increased financial support for family planning within a country, both from domestic and international sources. It can also be an important tool to bring together stakeholders in the family planning space, in the broader health context, and even in other sectors around a single agreed upon strategy and plan. And I think we've seen the role that CIPs can play in really convening all of these sectors and all of these stakeholders around an agreed upon strategy. So if you want to switch to the next slide, we'll now talk about the how. So we've talked about the what, the why, and now the how. Specifically, how do you plan, develop, and execute a CIP? So there is a 10-step process that has been documented and revised and evolved over the past 10 years. And that has been based on experience, lessons learned, and best practices. These 10 steps are organized into 3 phases. So the first phase of developing a CIP is to plan, to gain buy-in from relevant stakeholders, to muster resources to develop the CIP, and then to prepare for the CIP development process itself. The second phase focuses on developing the CIP document itself, which involves conducting a situational analysis, which then informs the technical strategy and implementation or activity plan. And this is followed by estimating the costs and resource gaps to implement the technical strategy, and if necessary, returning to the technical strategy and iterating to make sure that it is well scoped to the existing resource landscape. This phase also includes finalizing institutional arrangements to execute the CIP and launching and disseminating the CIP once it is approved. Finally, the third phase is focused on what could be arguably the most essential part of the process, which is actually implementing or executing the CIP. And this involves ensuring effective stewardship, designing and implementing performance monitoring mechanisms, and throughout the process, conducting continuous resource mobilization to ensure that there are resources to implement these activities and these strategies that have been outlined in the CIP. And we'll get more into the details of this process throughout the webinar, but this is just a brief introduction to these 10 steps. So before I hand it over to Laura and Michelle, I want to provide a brief introduction to the CIP Resource Kit itself. So as Martin has already mentioned, the CIP Resource Kit has been organized around this 10-step process that I just shared. And it is the result of collaboration, knowledge sharing, and thought leadership amongst governments, organization, experts, all with hands-on experience developing CIPs. There's also a CIP technical working group, which is made up of implementing partners, donors, and other stakeholders with this extensive experience in CIPs. And the technical working group plays a particular role in developing and revising the resource kit. The resource kit currently features 19 tools and resources that can be used by anyone involved in the CIP process, including ministry representatives, program planners, consultants, technical assistance providers, etc., throughout the CIP process. And in fact, each of these steps in the 10-step process has at least one resource to support. Over the past year or so, the CIP Resource Kit has undergone a refresh. And that has included revising a select number of resources, including new resources to fill in gaps and to provide overall clarity on what resources to use when. And I'll be sharing more about this process and the resource kit itself in session 4 at the end of this webinar. And as part of this continuous revision and learning agenda around CIPs, the CIP Technical Working Group has employed multiple feedback processes over the past year to collect lessons learned as well as feedback on the CIP process and resource kit itself. So to hear from you all and from other stakeholders of how the CIP process is going, what could be strengthened, what are areas that are difficult, what are resources that are particularly useful. Laura Hurley from Health Policy Plus and Michelle Folsom from Momentum Global Country and Leadership will share the results of these feedback processes in the next session. So I'm now going to hand it over to them to share what they heard.
Great, well, thank you very much, Rachel. That was a great setup and a great introduction. I'd like to take a minute and say thank you to FP 2030 for allowing us to come and present. I'd also like to particularly thank USAID and Momentum for enabling this, this paper to be written. The presentation this morning is going to be two-part. I'm going to share some work that I did in a paper that we refer to as the What We Heard paper. And Laura Hurley from Health Policy Plus is going to present some findings from a second study where they looked at the CIP approach using the OECD criteria. And she'll explain all of what that is when she begins. So what we're going to do this morning is I'm going to share some findings, Laura's going to share some findings, and then together we've put our heads together with a couple of key takeaways that we'd like to leave you with. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the Family Planning Cost and Implementation Plan Resource Kit. What we heard can be found if anybody wants to see the whole report on the USAID Momentum website. And now next slide, please. Okay, so the ask was pretty straightforward, and I think Rachel set it up nicely, is FP 2030 was looking to refresh the toolkit and thought it would be important that we actually go to the users, to the stakeholders that have been engaged in the process over the past decade, and to learn from them, to hear from them what was working, what wasn't, what could be better, what was missing. We used a human-centered design approach, which is really a solutioning process that puts influencers and stakeholders at the center of every challenge and opportunity. And I think that was critical. And the way, we put the paper together, it really is a string of voices representing a multitude of stakeholders. We heard from government officials, from FP 2020 focal points, from donors, from INGOs, from CSOs, and also from academic and research institutions. Our approach, we had two different studies. We had a small online survey with qualitative open-ended questions that had about 20 respondents. It was small, but what we wanted to do was really to identify the key issues so that when we did the immersions with a larger group of stakeholders, that we had a foundation of where I think as Guillaume liked to call it, the sticky wickets, where the challenges were. And then lastly, and the most important part of the data collection was phone interviews. It was COVID time that we held with 25 stakeholders across 11 countries. And if you look at the report, you can see a list specifically of who they were. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to begin with just a couple of overarching thoughts around what works. We heard from the National Family and Planning Manager in Ghana that it was critical to have a resource like this. Everyone can know what needs to be done, how much it'll cost. The kit made life easier. It helped us with resource mobilization and advocacy, and people took us more seriously, especially the donors. And I think, again, referring to having a concrete plan written down. Halima Sharif, a big advocate in Tanzania, was very excited that the second CIP was much more exciting because it was evidence-based. It had strategic priorities, and it enabled the partners to align themselves around those priorities and to do something about it at both the national and subnational levels. And I remember her specifically saying that there was a big shift between how they went about doing the first one versus the second CIP, that a lot of learning had taken place. And then the Minister of Health in Sindh province in Pakistan really appreciated that the whole process of conducting a CIP, it brought all of the non-governmental organizations together, that they had been working in silos. And one of the really positive outcomes is they have a very large number of functional working groups, really addressing every issue across the continuum of what it takes to deliver a family planning program. And that has strengthened their program tremendously. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now is take a minute. As Rachel explained, there's 3 phases and 10 steps. And I'd like to walk you through the steps and just highlight some of the issues that emerged. And again, we were looking, with lots of positive comments, lots of things reinforcing that we need to continue the process, but also, people said, hey, there's some room, we can do this better. We can make it easier. We can streamline the process. So I want to, again, just walk you through the steps and talk about what, what we might, need to think about, or this is what we were offering up to FP 2030 and the working group as they were making the changes. So phase 1 is really all about planning. And the first step is really looking at stakeholder buy-in and resource mobilization. And there was a wide range of answers and approaches used in terms of how you got that stakeholder buy-in. And a lot of it depended on where the country is in the continuum of, or in the evolution of its family planning program. But in Kenya, we heard, it's very important. You need to involve the ministry in one way or the other. But sometimes the ministry saw its involvement as a casual engagement. And as a result, they didn't really identify with the CIP. They didn't own it. And again, that was felt that ownership is critical. In West Africa, this was from a donor, said, well, too much consultation can lead to stagnation, and that you have to have the right people in the room. And she was suggesting that it would be important for countries to start small in their engagement and then share more widely, that put the engagement effort into the validation versus the initial creation. And I think, we heard views across that whole continuum. And in USAID Pakistan, they wanted to highlight that, they had a lot of engagement from a lot of different stakeholders, and they were very excited. They were also able to engage the private sector, and that they were part and parcel of the entire process throughout, from the initiation all the way to adopting and then eventually implementing the CIP. The second step is the roadmap. And that was a little bit confusing to people. They were trying to figure out, is this a roadmap for what we do, that maps out the process in and of itself, or of developing the CIP, or was it a roadmap for how to implement the CIP? And I think that the intention initially was that it's a roadmap for how to conduct the CIP. And here's yet another opinion coming out of Nigeria about how to start engaging and getting that ownership. And the roadmap can be tricky. It sometimes means educating stakeholders about family planning. You need to involve people from the planning department, but we quickly realized they had nothing to do with family planning. And we had to then start with, we want you to know what is happening in family planning, and then they got engaged. So again, I think there's a lot of strategies that we can learn from one another in the different countries. Let's go to the next slide, please, and we'll look at the development phase, which has a number of steps. So step one is really conducting the situation analysis. And it was considered one of the most essential steps. It's critical. Often it was a lot of cut and paste from a lot of other reports, and it was a very comprehensive report, but there was a lot of feedback that they spent a lot of time on it. They ended up with a big fat document that maybe wasn't then referred to as much as it could be. And it kind of reminded me of the old days of family planning, when we collected so much data that nobody was applying it. Nobody was using it. So I think there were, a lot of ideas put forward that, maybe it's a slide deck, maybe it's, we really need to hone in on what is it that we need to do and to understand, to have the context, but to really to enable us to do a good CIP. In Tanzania, we heard that people don't trust the data. They're afraid of being held accountable, so they don't put numbers forward. But she says, numbers don't lie. Also, she said, we have a culture of collecting data, but we don't analyze it. We don't use it. And that's something I think that the CIP needs to, keep working on, and making sure that what's done in the situation analysis phase is actually used. Next step moves into developing a technical strategy. And without a doubt, we heard that prioritization was one of the biggest challenges. And our colleague from USAID in West Africa, I thought, put it very nicely. It said, when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And I think that this is, one of the greatest challenges. Another colleague in East Africa was sharing that with broad participation comes multiple agendas. People need to go deep, tend to go deep on their individual thematic areas, and that you need to think about how things fit together. If you're going to talk about service delivery, then you have to talk about demand creation. And sometimes, all the dots weren't being connected. With regards to the whole prioritization issue, I think it's really often can be a facilitation issue. And a lot of people said, yeah, we needed help on how to manage the situation where we had so much inclusivity, we had so much participation, and everybody representing, I need it to be all about youth. I want it to be all about this, that they needed some help in terms of maybe some facilitation processes to address that challenge. Resources and cost. This is a challenge throughout, that, there's a lot of conversation that the CIPs have to reflect the actual funding streams. That often what happens is that the prioritization happens, and then a costing happens, and the amount that's costed to respond to the priorities is just not realistic. Those resources are not available. And so I think that's been a learning, and that it's been improving over time. A colleague from the Rwanda CIP process, the one that goes a few years back, really was encouraging that everybody needs to be, very practical, go back and look at the strategy again, look at that prioritization and make it realistic, make it implementable after you do that costing. And there needs to be that feedback loop happening. The last phase in development, or the last step, excuse me, is securing approval and hosting a launch, making some noise, sharing what information's been collected, what decisions are being taken, how people are working together. We heard from our colleague in West Africa that he was so happy when he did the launch. I can hear his voice now. When I saw the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance in the room, I was like, wow, this is what we need. The guy who has the money, he's in the room. We can make this happen. And I think, we saw that in a number of countries, people reflecting similar ideas. On the other end, we heard, a comment from a CSO in Kenya that talked about, the process ended up being so long, the reviews were so protracted, that there was a big hotel lunch, lots of media representation, they had lunch, but that it was more like an ending versus a kickoff. And I think that's kind of an important statement, because there's actually usually a body of people that are working to develop and taking home the costed implementation plan. And often there's been a consultant that's been hired, that's been spearheading that process, and then their job is kind of done. But the truth is, this is really just the beginning, as we then need to move into the implementation phase. And here I kind of think of it as that situation with the where you have a baby, when a baby's born, and when there's that little period where nobody's in charge of the baby, the person that delivered it versus that nurse that's caring for it, there's that gap. And I think that often happens in the execution of the CIP. So let's move to the next slide, please, and talk about execution, or how things are executed. So one of the critical things to ensure good execution of the CIP is really figuring out the stewardship and getting all the institutional relationships in place. In Nigeria, they're holding strategy meetings every month with the government leaders on the family planning plan. They call it the Blueprint Technical Meeting. They're looking at what's happening in country, what's happening to the implementation, where are the issues, how do they mitigate those issues, and that seems to be working very well. We also heard in Pakistan, I mentioned earlier, that they are developing, they've got these working groups going, and that particularly the non-governmental sector has really come together in a much more unified way. And that's been critical. So again, one of the things that we all know, we've all been involved in these working groups in countries or even globally, that there has to be a purpose. There has to be something that keeps people motivated and keeps them engaged in that process. Next step is performance monitoring. And there's been, I think that's been something that's been really improving over the years. There's been a lot of different approaches that have been taken. Sometimes it's just some of the working group meetings. Others have developed elaborate dashboards and different processes to track the data and the expenditure. I think one of the really important things that's happening around performance monitoring is, as countries are preparing to do their second or even their third CIP, they're kind of creating a new first step, which is, let's take stock and look at what we did in the first round of the CIP, what worked, what didn't. So for example, I think Kenya just recently did a qualitative review of the CIP that was really just a couple of meetings where everybody kind of put it out there of what worked and what not. And I think having that refresh really helps in the kickoff of the subsequent CIP. The last step in the execution phase is a resource mobilization phase. And I think you heard Rachel say earlier, and I'll reiterate, and we heard this from almost every stakeholder of, first and foremost, everybody always says, yes, yes, the resource mobilization is, the biggest challenge. It's the hardest thing. We never have enough.
75,000. I paid 50. The Munzo, the head of measurements. And then
Oops. Okay. Sorry. I think one of the things that we're encouraging and that we've learned is that we need to be doing resource mobilization throughout the entire process. You can't wait till you have the end and say, kind of scratch your head and say, what are we going to do now? How are we going to make this happen? But the CIP can make that easier. And we heard from a colleague in Nigeria, when you have a plan that's focusing on one vision and you have the strategies, it's easier for stakeholders to come together and provide support. It helps mobilize resources, it helps avoid duplication, and we can make sure that we're moving that agenda forward. I think we heard on an other end is that one of the things I think that was originally envisioned in the CIP was that there'd be a lot more domestic financing available, and that hasn't been as successful, but I think it's still a goal for all of us that we're working towards. So with that, I want to hand over to my colleague Laura, who's going to share. They took a very different approach to kind of look at what was working and not with the CIP. So Laura, over to you. And next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Michelle. We did take a very different approach. So the Health Policy Plus project conducted a review of the CIP approach to assess its value to countries' family planning programs. We used the OECD approach, which I'll get to on the next slide, as I walk through the methodology and respondents. And then after I do that quickly, I'll present some of our results. Next slide. So HP Plus first conducted a desk review to ascertain which FP 2020 focus countries had made commitments and used the CIP approach. We then developed an online survey for stakeholders in countries that used at least part of the approach. The online survey was primarily quantitative, using multiple choice and Likert scale questions with a few open-ended questions. Multiple choice questions were used to gather information on if and for what purposes individual countries use CIP tools. Open-ended questions asked for clarification on tool use and provided space for suggestions on how to improve upon various stages of the CIP approach, including obtaining stakeholder engagement, situational analysis, priority setting, costing, and performance monitoring. The Likert scale questions gathered feedback following the OECD DAC evaluation criteria shown here in the green box. So for the purposes of our assessment and on the survey, we defined relevance as the extent to which CIP processes responded to the country's needs. We defined coherence as compatibility of the CIP with other priorities. Effectiveness as the extent to which the CIP achieved its objectives. Efficiency as the extent to which the CIP delivered results in an economic and timely way. Impact as the extent to which the CIP generated higher level effects. And sustainability as the extent to which the benefits of the CIP approach will continue. The survey was emailed to over 200 CIP stakeholders in 40 countries, and data was collected last December and January. Next slide. So survey responses were received from 47 people in 30 countries. Half of the respondents were from West and Central Africa, while 33% were from East and Southern Africa, and 17% from Asia. We had a good distribution of roles represented, including government staff and implementing partners at 28% each, and then donors, civil society, and members of youth associations. Next slide. So moving on to results, I will primarily be presenting results of the Likert scale questions, as you can see here in this graph, in this first graph. We asked survey participants to respond to statements about the 6 OECD criteria with strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. In these graphs, I've put agree and strongly agree in blue on the right side of the axis, and neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree in gray, pink, and red, respectively, on the left side of the axis for easy comparison between statements. As mentioned, we defined relevance as the extent to which CIP processes responded to the country's needs. In this first slide, we see that the survey respondents found that CIP processes responded to the needs of the National Family Planning Program with an average of 74% agreement. However, CIP development, stakeholder engagement, and costing were deemed more relevant than, while resource mobilization and performance monitoring were deemed less relevant. Next slide. In this second slide on relevance, I'm showing responses to comments about the CIP process responding to the needs and priorities of other family planning stakeholders, not necessarily the National Family Planning Program. While there was an average of 73% agreement, and while resource mobilization and performance monitoring were still deemed less relevant, the biggest obstacle seems to be the ability of the CIP to influence subnational stakeholders with only 60% agreement. There seems to be some formatting changes to my slides. So some things seem to have shifted in translation, but they do line up, but it might be a Zoom issue. So apologies for that hiccup. Next slide. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with these slides. Okay, I don't know if I should be sharing my slides. But for coherence, we asked if CIP processes were aligned with other priorities and strategic plans. In this first slide, we see that survey respondents felt that this CIP was aligned with health sector priorities, including the Ministry of Health, donor, and civil society priorities, with an average of 80% agreement. I think we're on the wrong slide. Can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, sorry, thank you. So this is the health sector. So 80% agreement for health sector priorities, including Ministry of Health, donor, and civil society priorities, with an average of 80% agreement. Statements received the least agreement were statements related to budget priorities, showing ongoing resource alignment issues. Next slide. So I'm not sure what happened to these slides. There were some formatting changes, but the second slide on coherence shows responses to statements on alignment with other sector initiatives. CIP alignment with the education sector had the lowest agreement, while coherence with youth and population sector initiatives was deemed high. Next slide. That's a better formatted slide. Thank you. So next we have effectiveness. We defined effectiveness as the extent to which the CIP processes achieved its objectives. I've divided responses to effectiveness into 3 slides in the 3 phases of the CIP approach. So in this first graph, we see the survey respondents found CIP planning and CIP development process to be effective with an average of 84% agreement. So there were no noted obstacles for this phase, these 2 phases. Next slide. Unfortunately, resource mobilization efforts were deemed to be significantly less effective, with an average of only 43% agreement to effectiveness statements. Only 38% of respondents felt the CIP helped mobilize resources that would not have otherwise been allocated to family planning, and only 53% of respondents felt that conducting a CIP financial gap analysis supported resource mobilization efforts. Next slide. Yeah, we seem to have lost all of the comments on these slides. Okay, sorry about this. So the final slide on effectiveness shows responses to comments on CIP execution. Average agreement on the effectiveness of CIP execution, including implementation and monitoring processes and tools, was rather low at 54% agreement. Agreement was low across the statements, but the largest obstacle seems to be ensuring interventions achieved expected results and ensuring the country's family planning program met its stated objectives. Next slide. So next we have efficiency. We defined efficiency as the extent to which the CIP delivered results in an economic and timely way. Thanks for you swapping slides. So go 2 slides back. So the first slide on efficiency, one more. Yes, thank you. So we defined efficiency as the extent to which the CIP delivered results in an economic and timely way. So I divided these comments into the same categories as effectiveness. For this first slide, we see respondents felt CIP planning and development processes were carried out fairly efficiently with an average of 72% agreement. The bottom statement, which says CIP development was the most efficient use of resources, received the lowest agreement. So while efficiency doesn't seem to be a huge challenge, there's certainly room for improvement. Next slide. So this slide shows that respondents also felt that resource mobilization efforts were carried out efficiently with 72% agreement. This includes cost effectiveness of interventions, CIP costing, and the gap analysis. The statement, budget advocacy was an efficient use of time and resources, received the lowest agreement. Next slide. So unfortunately, CIP execution processes were not deemed to be efficient by survey respondents, with an average of only 50% agreement. While respondents found that CIP processes support the family planning program to be implemented within budget, ensuring efficiency of performance monitoring efforts seems to be a key challenge. Additionally, there was low agreement to statements about CIP execution processes, helping identify or address inefficiencies. Next slide. So defining impact as achieving higher level results, this slide shows that respondents felt that the CIP process generally moved the family planning program forward. It improved family planning indicators, and it helped the family planning program reach their full populations, more of the population, as well as key target populations. However, survey respondents felt that the CIP's ability to mobilize additional resources for family planning, both domestic and external, remained limited. Next slide. Finally, we have sustainability. We define sustainability as the extent to which the benefits of the CIP approach will continue. I divided sustainability statements into 2 main categories: stewardship and capacity. In this first slide on the sustainability of stewardship, we see that survey respondents feel that the government commitment, their stewardship, and stakeholder ownership is likely to continue. However, they question the sustainability of both domestic and external resource allocation. Next slide. So my final slide shows that respondents felt the capacity was built in a way that would contribute to sustainability of the CIP approach. Respondents primarily agreed that FP stakeholders have built capacity in health sector coordination, multi-sectoral coordination, and strategic planning. There was less agreement to statements regarding capacity for both resource mobilization and performance monitoring. Next slide. So I'll pass it back to Michelle, where we'll talk about our key takeaways and key sticking points and go from there. Thanks for swapping out the slides.
Okay, thank you, Laura, very much. I'm going to just take a couple of the key issues and reiterate some of the comments that we heard and some of the recommendations, perhaps as we move forward. Without a doubt, country ownership was seen as critical, but the reality is it's not always there. Everybody was very consistent and said we need to have that ownership at every stage of the way. There's a hypothesis that that's going to contribute to stronger institutionalization and sustainability. And many were also asking for technical capacity building in that process. So again, I think there's really no question about whether it's country ownership is vital. It's just a question of how. So next slide, please. We're calling this inclusivity, but maybe it really means engagement. And not only do you need government ownership, but you need engagement and ownership from all partners, from the entire range of stakeholders. And that's an area that, we had some mixed responses on that many said we weren't sufficiently engaging, community, religious and traditional leaders, the marginalized groups such as women, youth, or persons with disabilities. We didn't necessarily have the geographic representation from urban, peri-urban, and rural communities. We needed more input from CSOs in the private sector. We needed these stakeholders to represent the country's population. A key and an important thing that we heard is, though, it's really important to get the right people in the room at the right time, that often the processes were really delayed because the decision maker wasn't there, because this can be such a long and drawn out process. And I guess the second, or maybe I think one of the most important things to remember is that inclusivity is critical. We have to get as many stakeholders involved as possible. But again, it needs to be well managed and it needs to be facilitated. So it can't be that just the loudest voice in the room is taking control and dominating the situation. And we need to respect that, people are going to come in with their own agenda and they're going to push for it. But, you've got to kind of work with that and massage it and manage it. And sometimes too much inclusivity, too much participation can really lead to stagnation and make it different. So it's that balance, and it's a skill to manage and facilitate that. Next slide, please. Alignment. Alignment is a challenge as well. Respondents felt like there was sometimes a greater focus on donor priorities versus country priority or government interests, and that needs to be managed. And it was suggested that we need to consider really working within the coordination structures. We need to align with the funding and the budget cycles that are in the country. We have to align with the realities so that we're not coming forward with this recommendation and the government's not really looking to do budgeting for another 6 or 9 months, because in 6 or 9 months, all our numbers and our data will have changed. So I think that's a key step. We need to be aligned with both national and subnational strategies. A lot of countries started first doing just at a national level and then did subnational CIPs. Others, Pakistan as an example, I think has only done a subnational CIP. Again, you've got to meet countries where they are and work accordingly. And we need to make sure that we're aligned. I'm going to just keep reiterating that with work plans and with budgets in order to move forward. Next slide, Pete, please. Resources, again, a tremendous challenge. We need to be thinking about resource mobilization across the entire exercise. You can't wait until the end. We need to think about resource mobilization first for how are we going to fund and make the CIP happen. And then we also obviously need to be thinking about resources to actually implement and execute the plan once that's in place. We need to consider what the resource gaps are during that costing period, and we have to iterate the technical strategy. And that's that feedback loop I was mentioning earlier. And a lot of countries, there's a long list here, their process of developing the CIP was really hindered by a lack of resources, and whether that impacted participation or execution, it's kind of on both ends. But it's a big endeavor to take on a CIP, but I think everybody's feeling pretty confident it's well worth it in the end. So this, I'm going to hand over back to Laura to take us through the next couple of takeaways. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll go quickly. I know we're about at time. So Michelle talked a lot about prioritization in her CIP development side, but prioritization remains a sticking point for CIP.
Okay.
As Michelle mentioned earlier, if everything is priority, nothing is priority. So Dr. Mukhtar Gadanya from the Nigeria team said, prioritization is difficult. It often becomes quite confusing. You want to choose approaches that get you more users, but you also want to address equity issues. It's a tricky one. So we must balance the need to be cost effective and address unmet need and do equitable programming, regardless of whether that is an effective use of resources. We need more mileage for the dollar, but we need to also be equitable. So this quote really lays out the tension that we often feel between cost-effective high-impact practices and ensuring equity through interventions that are often not high-impact or cost-effective. Given limited resources, it may be useful for country stakeholders to have a common understanding of how to prioritize, or even for the global community to come together to establish defined criteria for prioritization, including guidance on balancing equity, impact, coverage, and cost effectiveness. Next slide. So ensuring the engagement of relevant stakeholders at decentralized levels of the health system, as well as stakeholders outside the health system, remains a challenge. Thus, respondents from both of our activities made recommendations regarding improved dissemination of the CIP. A Cameroonian survey respondent suggested setting up an effective and affordable communication mechanism that would suit grassroots stakeholders. Others suggested developing short briefs or other tools for specific audiences that would summarize key points in the CIP relevant to them. Next slide. So our final key takeaway is performance monitoring. In HP+'s study, only 50% of countries reported conducting CIP performance monitoring, and responses to survey questions presented challenges regarding its effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability. In both studies, respondents emphasized the importance of CIP reviews and other monitoring activities for achieving CIP targets. Some respondents said they created shorter-term operational plans, whereas others created color-coded dashboards to monitor progress. Others used Samasha Medical Foundation's motion tracker to support civil society to foster accountability to ensure CIP investment and implementation. So this concludes our presentation. So thank you to FP 2030 for this. And we're now going to take some time in breakout groups to dive deeper into 3 of these common sticking points we talked about. We'll hear from government and CSO stakeholders from Niger, Madagascar, and Pakistan. And I'll pass it over to Rachel, who will provide more direction for participating in these breakout groups. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Laura, and apologies for the issues on the slides. We will definitely make sure that the correct slides are shared out afterwards, so everyone can see the results of that research that you did. So apologies again on that. So thank you both, Michelle and Laura. I think the sticking points that you raised really resonate not only for CIPs, but also for much of broader health policy and strategy work in general. And I know we could easily have an entire webinar about each one of these topics and have a very rich discussion, but we did want to set aside some time in smaller breakout groups to dive deeper into these topics and really hear about how countries have tackled these sticking points in their own CIP processes, and what lessons that they've learned. So these breakout groups are on the left side of the slide, you'll see, and they will take a form of a facilitated Q&A with our country discussants. The first group will discuss performance monitoring, and will feature Dr. Vulana from Madagascar. And if you are interested in joining this group, please remain in this main Zoom room. And this group will have simultaneous translation from French to English. The second breakout group will focus on resource mobilization and will feature Dr. Hassan Sanda from Niger. And this group will only be in French. And then finally, group 3 will focus on country stewardship and will feature Dr. Talib Lashari from Pakistan and will be in English. So there are directions for selecting a breakout group on the right side of the slide. You should be able to select the breakout group based on both your language of preference and the topic that you find most relevant or interesting to you given your CIP needs and experiences. We are going to go straight into breakout groups now. So if you are having trouble choosing a breakout room, please put questions or issues in the chat and we will try and help. But you should see a little square that lets you look at the list of breakout rooms and to select the breakout room to join. So let's give a couple minutes for folks to join, and then we will get started.
Yes, that's correct. The breakout room number 1, the performance monitoring will stay in this main plenary. If anyone would like to join one of the other 2 rooms, please do let me know either in the chat or by unmuting yourself, and then we'll move forward so that the performance monitoring group can go ahead and get started. So if you would like to be in the resource mobilization breakout room, that will be in French, please let me know. Or if you would like to be in the country stewardship breakout room, that will be in English, please let me know.
Sorry, I am interested in the process evaluation, but I also understand that there is translation.
I'm having a hard time. hearing you. If you want to write it in the chat, that might be helpful. All right, I think we can go ahead and start this main plenary group, and I will go ahead, and if anyone else wants to be moved, please feel free to write it in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this group that will talk about the follow-up of performance. And if this is not what you want to talk about, you can definitely send us a message on the chat box and put the group that you would rather be joining, and the facilitator will help you. Otherwise, I want to welcome you to this group. My name is Trinity Zion, and I am a technical advisor at FHI 360. And I am a part of the technical group that works on PMBs, and I have the pleasure to present a colleague who's very active in this space, Dr. Bologna from Madagascar. She is President of Service of the Maternity Without Risk and Family Planning in Health Ministry in Madagascar. She will be with us to share her experiences in the follow-up of performances of BIMBs. And I am going to go ahead and ask her some questions. And after that, we are going to open the floor to all of you to also share your experiences. So first of all, I'm going to invite Dr. Vololoniania to say hello. Are you there? Thank you so much, Trinity. The interpreter lost the sound. The interpreter is not able to hear in Dr. Bologna. We cannot hear you at all, Dr. Bologna. I think you are too far from the microphone. Are you able to get closer? Yes, good morning, Trinity. Good morning. The sound is not there.
Oui, je pense que ça
Can you hear me? Apologies, the interpreter cannot hear anything.
Non, c'est pas bon. Dr. Volona, vous avez...
No, that is not going to work. Do you have a microphone, Dr. Bologna?
Vous êtes à côté de votre machine?
Are you close to your computer?
Yes. OK, ça va? Yes, ça va mieux.
D'accord.
OK, bon, on va voir comment ça marche. Je vais poser la première question.
Okay, let's see if it works. I'm going to ask her first question, and maybe we can, if you can talk as close as possible to your microphone. So the first question is, briefly, could you describe how you follow the PIMB implementation in Madagascar? What are your approaches and what are the tools you use? The interpreter is not able to hear anything. Apologies. Can you hear me? I don't know what's going on.
OK, merci. Sinon, je peux vous inviter tous les participants dans le...
I can invite the rest of the participants in the group to go ahead and put your names and organizations on the chat box, and maybe even your country where you're joining us from today on the chat, and that way we will know who is with us.
Même si vous voulez... Yes, Dr. Volona?
Yes, Dr. Bologna. Okay, I'm going to start responding to your question. The apologies, the interpreter does not have any sound.
Ça vaut pas mieux.
Allô?
Oui.
Sorry.
Vous avez trouvé un micro?
Were you able to find a microphone?
Yes. On s'excuse pour les difficultés.
We are so sorry about the technical issues. Is this better? I think so. Let's see if this is going to work. So to allow the government to prioritize intervention and mobilize the stakeholders and estimate the cost, well, given the resources, the Ministry of Health and their partners developed an action plan for family planning in 2016. It's a roadmap that is specific of the National Program of Family Planning that determines activities that have priority. This allows us to get to our objectives and with the associated costs and the activities and the resources that are necessary that the country has to find to be able to attain their family planning objectives for 2020. This plan is also an implementation plan for the program and also will have resources in Madagascar. So starting September 2017, we had a follow-up with the exception of the national plan by the committee through quarterly reviews. And in that community, that is made up of 3 ministries in the Health Ministry, for Family Planning, Population Ministry, and the Ministry of Youth and Sports. And they also had different technical and financial parts like the USID, the WHO, and different organizations of implementation in Madagascar. This is how we are able to revise the national plan that has been fixated or that has been created in Madagascar. And so on the dashboard of the PIMB, there is already the goals that we're supposed to reach, and we update all the data and the different indicators at each quarterly follow-up meeting. And in April 2021, we were able to revise this plan, and during the final revision, the final revision was done in 6 steps. First one being data collection through surveys and revising the document. Then we analyzed these data on the dashboard in the budgeted national action plan, and we analyzed all the responses as far as all the gaps, and we were able to revise all the documents. And then the third stage, we were able to interpret all the results and information analysis. And then the last step, we were able to work with the National Committee for Family Planning, and we had exchanges about the results. And we were able to talk about suggestions and what things needed to be improved. And then we integrated all the comments that were shared in the workshop. And then the last stage, the 6th one, which is the validation workshop, with a follow-up of the final report. The efforts had an effect on the mobilization of the program, but we only had 89% covered. And this was with the contribution of the technical and financial partners. So after the CAP analysis of 2020, with the PIMB, $174,000 million, while the global financing that received was $154 million. So after the final analysis, we were able to get government resources, and we were not able to obtain the results that we wanted. We saw that there was a lack of resource mobilization and tactics that should have allowed us to have the products long term. And these exist in the Family Planning 2020. So the state really didn't make much effort as far as this goes. But between 2016 and 2018, the funds went from 100 million to 2019 with 66 million ariars. And this amount represents 83% of the health cost in general. So as far as the program financing was covered by all entities with our partners like USAID, who mobilized many financing opportunities, and we had a surplus for PF for 2020. And that is how we were able to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Voliona, for this rich experience. Maybe others like myself say that, there is a lot of information here. Maybe I should revisit activity by activity to point by point, because you have talked about so many important points. First, you said that you've been doing since the beginning of PANB, like quarterly revisions with the diverse participants. And you said that there is a dashboard. Could you please explain further what is incorporated in that dashboard? How do you fill it out? Are the partners participate in the dashboard? And when you did your quarterly meetings, and how did you organize yourselves? What were the discussions centered on? Thank you very much for this question. The PANB exists and has 6 steps that are previously defined. There is the first stage that talks about policy environment. Second, the creation of requests, and the number 3, the access to services, and 4, securing the products, and 5, funding, and then 6, supervision and coordination and evaluation. So for every strategic step, there are activities that are considered to be a priority activities, and for every priority activities, there are targets. They could be annual, or could be conducted every 5 years. So they are objectives that have to be attained. So we do updating of data on a quarterly basis, and we've had people coming, counterparts with their data. They rely on their sources. For example, if we take the example of access for service access, in this component, or in this step, there are targets defined. For example, 300 healthcare providers for a specific year, for a specific targets. So we train them in family training, and this is done by the Ministry of Health, and let's say, and we do during the workshop, we do compilation of data for each target, following an existing dashboard. In case the data are not available, what we do when data is not available, what we do is that we send along an Excel sheet so that everyone can fill it out and for everyone to have the ability to cite their accomplishments. In addition to that, this allows them to have access to their data. And so the dashboard is filled out and everybody has access to it. Thank you, Dr. Violona. This is very interesting what you're saying here, because it gives us more info regarding the process, and the participants, I'm sure, had an idea on the further info on the process. I put in the chat for everyone here that there is on the website. There is a toolkit for PANB, number 9, specific, and especially if, for the performance monitoring. There are so many tools. There is an example here on the website, on the dashboard, that you can refer to, and you can download as well, adapt to your programs. So Dr. Violona gave us an example of a tool that has been used at Madagascar level. I just wanted now to revisit the point pertaining to a midterm revision that was conducted. You referred to that, right? And you also said that there is a final revision in agreement with our participants. I wanted to let our participants that there is a tool in the chat and there are guidelines for performance follow-up. There is a detailed guide on the different kinds of revisions that are conducted, that you can conduct yourselves, including midterm revisions and final revisions.
Dans le site web.
It's a new tool that will be available at the website very soon. So Dr. Violona, could you please inform us on the midterm revision and how did that help you and assist you to refresh the PANB plan? I think you said, I heard you saying that it helped you adapt to the plan, to the midterm plan. Could you elaborate on that point? With the midterm revision, we noticed that if there is, for example, a deficiency of in the implementation, for example, of a given activity, what we do is that we make decisions through planning of activities, and we look at priority activity that is considered to be defective. So what we do, if we see, for example, the dissemination of FP law at Madagascar, adopted by Madagascar in 2018. So for the dissemination of this law legislation, we noticed that during the PNB, there is an activity that that had some flaws. So we planned some activities. We planned an activity around the training of journalists at the radio, and what we did was decentralize this activity. What we did is that we conducted the trainers, trainees, and the agents at the level of some ministries. For example, Ministry of Health. What we did to train and Ministry of Youth and Sport, and then Ministry of some national ministries. And what we did was conduct those trainings and we had sessions to address those deficiencies, and we considered these during the planning process, these trainings during the planning process. It's just an example of how we did this process. Thank you, Dr. Violona. Maybe I can ask you another general question. I would like to invite our participants to react or to answer. So what are the major challenges that you met during the implementation of the PANB. What are the major challenges? Dr. Violona first, and then participants can join. Hello, are you there? Dr. Violona, are you there? Hello? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello?
Dr. Violona?
Dr. Violona, can you hear us?
Est-ce que les autres peuvent m'entendre?
Other participants can hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
I can hear you.
I think we lost Dr. Violona. Je pense que la connexion est coupée.
I think we lost Dr. Violona. I think the connection was interrupted and we lost her. I hope we'll see if she can join back. Otherwise, maybe I can ask you, ladies and gentlemen, the question. All of you, dear participants, if you're here, would you like to share with us some challenges that you noticed or that you met with during the follow-up, the performance follow-up or monitoring during the PANB? You can answer in English or in French. If we have interpreters here to make sure that simultaneous interpretation is taken care of. Thank you. Hi, Trinity. Hello. I am so sorry. My connection was interrupted. I really apologize. I don't know if you heard the question, my last question before the connection was cut. No, I didn't hear the question. The question was as follows. What are the major challenges that you met with during the follow-up of PANB performance? The major challenge. The interpreter apologizes. The sound is not clear. Inaudible.
Dr. Violona?
Dr. Violona, we cannot hear you clearly. It was just just like it happened in the beginning. Hello. Yes. Is it going better? Yes. The first challenge that we met, it's not going well. I'm so sorry, Dr. Violona. So we heard a few words and then nothing. It was inaudible. Sorry about that. The major challenge. The interpreter apologizes. Dr. Violona, so sorry, we cannot hear you at all.
Je ne sais pas ce que vous avez fait.
Hello?
Yeah.
Is it better? It's not better. Not a lot better. Maybe Dr. Violona. Maybe we could mute yourself and see what you can do to resolve this connection. I think I'm going to invite the participants to respond to the question if someone would like to start and share the challenges that they met with during the follow-up of a PANB performance, or if there is someone who can share their approach or their, we would like, can you hear me now? Yes, please continue to speak to make sure that the sound is not interrupted. Thank you.
No. C'est pas toujours clair.
It's not clear. The sound is clear. We apologize. Hello. You're far away. Dr. Violona, I would like to please kindly put your sound on mute and see how you can resolve the issue. We apologize. Thank you so much. Are there any participants among the existing participants who would like to talk about performance follow-up? We're so sorry about the tech issues. We apologize one more time. Are there any participants who'd like to share with us the major challenges that were met during the performance follow-up of PANB? Thank you. Is there someone here who has already participated to a review process, either a midterm or a final review process? Is there someone here who participated in a final or a midterm review? Thank you. Nobody?
Je pourrais essayer de revenir, s'il vous plaît. Vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? I think Dr. Violona, the sound is better. The first challenge I would like to share with is pertaining to the data facilitation with the stakeholders. The interpreter apologized one more time. It is inaudible.
C'est un indicateur qu'on a choisi de suivre.
It is an indicator we chose to follow. The interpreter does not have sound. Dr. Valonia, we really, no, really, so sorry. This is very difficult to hear you. It's
Peut-être on est presque à temps. Donc,
I think we're already at the time currently. So I'm going to invite you, like I was saying earlier, sorry. I want to invite participants to open your mics if you want to share anything about challenges or a success story as far as the PMB follow-up. So this is a forum to, exchange information and have a discussion. So if anyone wants to say something, they can. Otherwise, we have 1 minute before we return to our plenary session. Okay, we are really sorry for this difficulties, but I hope that at least in the beginning we did hear many, success strategies that Dr. Valona shared with us, with the stakeholders in Madagascar. I hope that gave you some ideas, maybe inspired you a bit, and that you are going to visit the toolbox to get inspired and maybe use all the features that are available. Thank you so much, everyone. So we are going to go back to our plenary session. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. This is Rachel. I know folks are coming back from breakout groups, and I hope the breakout group discussions were rich. I know that there have been some technical issues, so I apologize for that. I know I was sitting in on the country leadership session, and there was some really great experiences shared by Dr. Lashari. So Thank you all, and thank you particularly to our country level discussants, Dr. Lashari, Dr. Sanda, and Dr. Volina for sharing your experiences. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So we're now moving into our final session. Thank you for sticking with us. We are going to spend the next 15 or so minutes diving deeper into the CIP Resource Kit itself, how it's evolved, and what specific resources are available as countries move forward with CIPs and as we look towards 2030. Next slide. Thank you. So we've touched on this already, but just to return to what is this CIP Resource Kit itself. So it is a collection of tools and resources, specifically 19 tools that can support the planning, development, and execution of costed implementation plans. And these tools and resources have been developed specifically for CIPs and based on experience of planning, developing, and implementing CIPs over the past 10 years. It also contains a library of additional resources that can be used throughout the process. So all of these resources, all of the information on CIPs can be accessed at fp2030.org/CIP. So I would really encourage everyone to visit this website after this webinar and really dive into the resources, the materials, and take a look and sort of see what would be relevant and useful for you in your CIP needs. If you want to go to the next slide. So some of you might be familiar with the CIP Resource Kit itself already, and it has been in existence for many years now, and it has evolved over the years. So after the London 2012 summit, and as CIPs really began to be developed by countries in earnest to really support the operationalization of their FP 2020 and other family planning commitments, the resource kit was initially developed to document this CIP process. So what does it actually involve to develop a CIP? What is a CIP itself? How do we know what a CIP looks like across all of these different country contexts and needs? And also to really provide best practices and continuity to CIPs across all of these, all the years and all of the country contexts. So that was really its original goal and remains its goal throughout the years. And since its inception, the CIP Resource Kit has been revised multiple times as new resources are added, as existing resources are revised, as other resources that are not CIP specific are linked into the resource kit. And it's become, you know, a really rich body of tools. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, this most recent revision process took place over the past year or so and was led by the CIP Technical Working Group. And this revision process is part of a broader continuous learning agenda around CIPs and has focused on a few key areas. So first is clarifying what exactly is the resource kit, what resources are a part of it, and when do you use them? And I think with past revisions, as the CIP Resource Kit has grown, sometimes it's not always clear, you know, what exactly is the resource kit, what is relevant for a particular need or request from a country. And also over time, you know, some resources have become out of date or less relevant. So what we've done is to work to clearly outline exactly what is the CIP Resource Kit and to clearly identify the tools that are most relevant and useful for specific steps of the process. And I'll go through that in the next slide. We've also set aside a group of resources as what we're calling cross-cutting resources. So the resource kit is organized by the 10 steps, but there is a need to capture resources that are relevant and useful across all of the 10 steps. And so we put these resources into this cross-cutting section that is new. And we've also made targeted revisions to existing resources to really strengthen the emphasis on the iterative nature of the CIP process. So as we all know, there are these 10 steps. That's a very linear process, but in practice, developing and implementing a CIP is much more iterative. You might return to a step. You might need to revisit the technical strategy after you cost and, rescope to make sure that it is aligned and scoped to the existing resource landscape, for instance. So we've tried to add in some language around iteration, also to strengthen guidance on strategic prioritization, which I know Michelle and Laura talked about in their presentation as something that can be a challenge to really narrow down and identify what those strategic priorities are that the CIP is going to focus on. We also know that, the process itself can at times be time-consuming and heavy. And as more countries are developing second or third CIPs, there's a need for detailing a process for countries to build on previous CIPs as they develop subsequent strategies, rather than reinvent the wheel every time. And so we've tried to add in more flexibility to the approach in the technical design. And then finally, HP Plus has developed 4 new resources to fill existing gaps in the resource kit. And I'll get into those 4 new resources shortly. And I just want to emphasize at this stage that this refresh is a part of a larger continuous learning process around CIPs. And we recognize that there are areas where the CIP resource kit could be strengthened or adjusted to better fit the needs of countries. And the feedback and processes that Laura and Michelle shared, as well as evidence from experience and thoughts even shared in webinars like this, will continue to feed into future revisions of the CIP resource kit as this work evolves and we continue to learn. So this is one step in a continuous process of learning around CIPs. So if you can go to the next slide. And with that context in mind, I wanted
Avec
to
ce
share
contexte en tête, je voulais partager l'esquisse de le plan de. Il y a beaucoup d'informations sur la diapositive, si vous voulez. Donc, passez à la page. Vous allez avoir donc le plan du processus. Mais pour vous accompagner par rapport à cette étape, sur la gauche, nous avons nos 10 étapes. Et ces étapes sont restées les mêmes de manière large. Mais il y a au milieu, donc la colonne au milieu montre les ressources et les kits. Donc, vous allez voir que nous avons les outils, les 19 qui ont été spécifiquement développés pour le CIP. Certains sont en alignement avec les étapes. Par exemple, dans l'étape 1, vous allez obtenir l'adhésion et sécuriser les ressources pour le développement, et puis CIP pour soutenir la décision. Et puis, vous allez aussi les étapes prochaines qui vont être utilisées et qui sont pertinents à travers tout le processus. Et après, les ressources qui sont dans la partie verte sont relativement nouveaux, et puis de ceux qui sont dans la partie bleue ont été révisés dans ce processus. Et puis finalement, vous voyez que nous avons créé quelque chose que nous nommons comme librairie bibliothèques complémentaires ou supplémentaires du CIP, même s'ils n'ont pas été spécifiquement développés pour le CIP, et même s'ils ont donc ont été prouvés comme étant importants et pertinents par rapport au processus du CIP. Par exemple, des outils qui soutiennent l'établissement ou le plaidoyer peuvent être utilisés pour le plaidoyer, ou des ressources qui peuvent aider à identifier des interventions à haut impact.
Strategy. So this is the overall view of the resource kit. And then if you want to go to the next slide, I will take us through sort of each of these sections and highlight a few resources that I think may be interesting for you. And as I'm going through this, please feel free in the chat to mention or drop resources that you have used in the past that are particularly relevant or ones that you are interested in learning more about. We would love to hear from you of how you are interacting with the resource kit or how you would like to interact with the resource kit in the future. So please use the chat function for that. So looking at the cross-cutting resources, I want to highlight that first resource, which is the 10-step process for CIPs. This is a key reference document for the entire resource kit. So if you are wondering where to start, this is your key starting point for the resource kit. It will walk you through all of the 10 steps and activities under each of the steps. We'll highlight what resources are relevant for what stage, what to use when. This really is the, I would say, the core of the resource kit. And from there, you can branch off to other resources. The other cross-cutting resources support stakeholder engagement throughout the CIP process, which we've learned and heard in breakout groups and in plenary, is really an essential piece of the puzzle. There's also a resource that outlines the roles and responsibilities of all relevant parties, from the government to consultants, implementing partners, etc., throughout the process. And then finally, we have the Right Sizing Family Planning Toolkit, which is a mini toolkit in itself and is really a key reference document to grounding CIPs in rights-based family planning. If you want to go to the next slide. For the resources in phase 1, which is the planning phase, there is one new resource I want to highlight, which is really to support making a decision to develop a CIP. And this resource walks relevant stakeholders through questions and scenarios to ensure that they are ready to embark on the CIP process, that they have the necessary buy-in and resources to do so, and that they are aligned with existing health strategies and processes to really set the entire process up for success. This phase also has resources to make a case for CIPs and communicate their role and value to stakeholders both within the health sector and other sectors, as well as an illustrative work plan for the CIP development process. If you want to go to the next slide. Phase 2 focuses on developing the CIP strategy itself, the document that we all know as the CIP. And the key resource in this phase is the guidance for developing a technical strategy. And this tool really walks you through the process of developing a technical strategy, from conducting the situational analysis, identifying and setting an FP goal for the CIP, identifying evidence-based interventions, and setting these strategic priorities, which we've talked about a lot on this webinar, as well as developing the results framework with targets and the implementation plan, et cetera. So really the meat and potatoes of the CIP. And this resource is in many ways the largest resource in the kit and contains many annexes, worksheets, tools, conceptual frameworks, and examples that are helpful in the process. So if you are wondering, I would really like a tool to help conduct a problem analysis for a CIP, go to the guidance for technical strategy, because that has that type of tool in that resource. Complementing this guidance is the CIP costing tool and user guide, which is meant to be really used hand in hand with the technical strategy. And this tool also contains a gap analysis tool, so you can do a resource gap analysis. And in practice, something I think Michelle and Laura talked about is that the technical strategy and costing often take place in an iterative manner and in parallel rather than subsequently. So where after costing, you may need to return to the technical strategy and adjust to ensure the CIP is scoped to the existing resource landscape and is useful in practice. If you want to go to the next slide. So finally, in phase 3, we have resources that are focused on supporting the execution of the CIP, including stewardship, performance monitoring, end-line reviews, and resource mobilization. So in practice, I think we know that this can be the most difficult part of CIPs, to ensure that this beautiful, thoughtful, strategic document that has been created with much time and effort and resources is actually put into practice, implemented, and evaluated. And so we have 3 new resources in this phase that I want to highlight. The first provides basic guidance on 6 essential stewardship functions and what they mean for CIP execution. And this tool can be used by stakeholders to ensure that the CIP execution reflects best practices in stewardship, something I know that Dr. Lashari shared about in the breakout group around country stewardship and country ownership. There is also a new resource to provide guidance on end-line reviews for CIPs. So how to do them, including sample methodologies, interview guides, etc., and how to use them to inform the future CIPs. So again, starting from the beginning of looking at what we've done in the past and how can we let this inform the next stage of CIPs. And then finally, there is a new resource that shares lessons learned and examples from countries on how to mobilize resources for CIP implementation, from public sector to private sector to innovative channels. And I know that Dr. Sanda from Niger shared some lessons learned from Niger of how they have mobilized resources for the CIP, and those types of stories and lessons learned and best practices are collected in this new resources on approaches for mobilizing resources for FP-CIPs. So I know we're coming to the end, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. If you want to go to the next slide, we have, I think, about 7 minutes for a Q&A. That screenshot on the slide is of the landing page for the CIP Resource Kit. So please go to the website and take a look and really explore these tools. But we're going to use the chat function to do this final Q&A. So please put in the chat box any questions, comments that you have about CIPs or anything that was discussed today. So including the resource kit, CIPs in general, lessons learned, sticking points across the process. And then I'll either answer your question or I will direct your question to relevant members of the technical working group that have joined the call with us. So I am looking at the chat. Let's see if we have any. Thank you, Laura, for sharing the link to the resource kit. So while folks are dropping in questions, I see Anne has a question for the group, which I think is a really good one. So I will pose it and see if anyone wants to raise their hand on the webinar to share. Any thoughts on the CIP process and the toolkit as they've used it? Are there tools that you've used that you've found really useful? Are there tools that you've used that you have been confused by? I see that Zainab said that it's necessary for the CIP to be able to accommodate changes and reviews identified during the midterm review. That's an interesting point. I don't know if Trinity or others thinking about performance monitoring have thoughts on how to accommodate changes and reviews that are identified during some midterm or performance monitoring reviews.
I'm looking to see if Dr. Volina is on the line, because we actually talked about this in our group, and she offered an example. Dr. Volina, est-ce que vous avez toujours des difficultés technologiques?
Dr. Volina, do you always have those technical issues? Are you still with us? Yes, I am here. Yes, I am here with you. There was this question from one of the participants, and the question was as follows: how can we review or adapt the implementation of PANB according to results of midterm review? You've offered one example in our small group. Could you please reiterate that example with us? Thank you. During the midterm review, sorry, the interpreter apologizes, inaudible. Dr. Volina, we apologize. We see that there are always, there's still tech issues. Maybe you can type the answer in the chat. We apologize for that, and we thank you.
So Dr. Volina will share some thoughts in the chat in response to that question. I see a question about what provisions are made in the CIP to enhance post-project evaluation. So I think what you're referring to is what we call an end line evaluation of CIPs. So at the end of the CIP, really evaluating what has been done, what has worked, what has not. And so that is actually a new resource that is a part of the CIP Resource Kit that can be found on fp2030.org/CIP. It's very useful. I would really encourage you to take a look at it, because it does walk through that process and how you can use that process also to inform the next CIP. I see a hand raised from Abdel. Do you want to speak? We have just 2 minutes left. Oh no, I'm sorry. I think there's an issue of communication.
Oui, c'est Dr. Hassan Sandamega. Enfin, je voulais...
Okay. Dr. Hassan, Dr. Hassan Sandamanda.
Vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me?
Oui, vous avez demandé tout à l'heure.
You have asked earlier a question about the tool.
L'outil FP Smart.
FP Smart, the tool. FP Smart was really our tool. It allowed us, as I said earlier in my presentation, to understand so many things and to conduct several processes. And it allowed us to understand what was happening in other countries. The CIP is not bad, despite its intricacy, its size and its length. I think it's a very good tool, but you have to know how to use it efficiently. Maybe time can tell, and we probably we can do it in the future, but it would be good to know how to use it, and we thank you for sharing some insights regarding that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanda. That's very helpful. I think we are at time, unfortunately. We are taking note of all the questions and comments in the chat. And so we will be sure to follow up with the recording, with the slides, and with the link to all the resources that have been mentioned. Thank you all again for sharing your time and sharing your experiences with us. And have a wonderful Thursday.